this lesson, we are going to be looking at the variety of living organisms and how they can be grouped together by similar characteristics. Just to recap, you should now know the 8 characteristics of life, remembered as Mr. Schreng. Movement, respiration, sensitivity, homeostasis, reproduction, excretion, nutrition, and growth. Now we know how to identify whether something is living or not. Let's look at the different types of living organisms. There are more than 10 million species of organisms living on Earth, and then there are many species which have sadly become extinct. To try to put some order into these species, they've been placed into groups called kingdoms. Then each kingdom is broken down into smaller groups, which are then broken down into smaller groups, and so on until we get to the individual species. Members of each group are related. They are descended from a common ancestor by the process of evolution, which we cover later on in the course. The common ancestry is reflected in the similarities of structure and function of the members of a group. The 5 kingdoms are plants, animals, fungi, protoctists, and prokaryotes, which contain bacteria. Let's look at the plants to start with. This kingdom contains familiar plants such as trees, flowering plants such as cereal, like the maize shown here, legumes such as peas or beans, and one of my favourites, strawberry plants, but also contain the simpler plants such as mosses and ferns. All plants are multicellular, which means they are made up of many cells. Their main distinguishing feature is that their cells contain chloroplasts, which contain the green pigment chlorophyll, and they carry out photosynthesis. This is the process that uses light energy to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. This glucose can be made into starch, which can then be stored in their cells until it is needed, or it can be converted to sucrose to be transported around the plant to where it is needed. Plant cells have a cell wall around the outside of them, and this cell wall is made up of a carbohydrate called cellulose. Next, we will look at the animals. We belong to the animal kingdom. There is a huge variety of animals, including the well-known ones such as horses, dogs, and insects like this housefly and the mosquito here, and fish, but also sponges, mollusks, worms, starfish, and crustaceans. Animals can be split into vertebrates like us, which means they have a vertebral column or backbone, and invertebrates such as insects, which do not have a backbone. Animals are also multicellular organisms. Their cells do not contain chloroplasts as they eat their food. They do not need to make it by photosynthesis. Animal cells also do not have cell walls, so their cells can change shape. This is an important feature for organisms that need to move from place to place. Movement in animals is achieved in various ways, but often involves coordination by a nervous system. Animals store spare glucose in their cells as a large compound called glycogen. The kingdom fungi includes mushrooms and toadstools, as well as moulds, like the mucor shown here, which you may have seen growing on vegetables which have been forgotten in the vegetable rack. These groups of fungi are multicellular, but some fungi, such as the yeast shown here, are unicellular, in other words, made of single cells. The cells of fungi do not contain chloroplasts, as they do not photosynthesize. Fungi get their food by secreting digestive enzymes onto the food, and once it is digested into smaller molecules, the fungus then absorbs it. This is known as saprotrophic feeding. Because the digestive enzymes are secreted out of the cells, they are known as extra out of cellular out of the cell enzymes. Like plant cells, fungal cells have cell walls, but they are not made of cellulose like in plants. Instead, they are made of a substance called chitin. The cells can also store carbohydrate, and they use glycogen for this, like animal cells. The mushrooms and toadstools you see growing in the fields are actually the reproductive organ called a fruiting body. Once they have stopped reproducing, these fruiting bodies die back, but this leaves the main part of the fungus under the soil, which are the thread-like filaments called hyphae. You sometimes see these as fairy rings in fields. Here the hyphae are radiating out from the centre of the circle, and when the fungus is ready to reproduce, the fruiting bodies grow to form the perimeter of a circle. These hyphae form a complex mesh-like network called a mycelium. The hyphae cells contain more than one nucleus per cell. The kingdom Protoctista, or protoctists, are sometimes called the dustbin group, but please don't call them this in an exam, because they are a mixed group of organisms that don't fit into the plants, animals or fungi groups. Most protoctists are microscopic single-celled organisms. Some look like animal cells, such as amoeba, and some have features like plants, such as this chlorella. Algae belong to Protoctista. Most algae are unicellular, but some species, such as seaweeds, are multicellular and can grow to a great size. Seaweeds, however, is just a general term for the plant-like structures growing in the sea. Seaweeds can actually be plants, Protoctista, or even prokaryotes. The protoctist Plasmodium, shown here, is responsible for causing malaria. There are two main distinct types of cells, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. All the organisms described so far are composed of eukaryotic cells, which means they have a nucleus. These eukaryotic organisms have a nucleus surrounded by a membrane, along with other membrane-bound organelles, such as mitochondria and chloroplasts. But there are also organisms made of simpler cells which have no nucleus, mitochondria or chloroplasts. The genetic material is just floating freely in the cytoplasm. These are called prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic means before a true nucleus. The kingdom prokaryotes contain bacteria, which are microscopic, single-celled organisms. Their cells are much smaller, about 10 times smaller, to give a rough idea, than those of eukaryotic organisms, and have a much simpler structure. There are three basic shapes of bacteria: spheres, rods, and spirals, but they all have a similar internal structure. Bacterial cells are surrounded by a wall for protection and to maintain the shape. Bacterial cell walls are made of peptidoglycan, which is a mixture of carbohydrates and proteins. Some species have another layer outside this wall called a capsule or slime layer. Both give the bacterium extra protection. The cell has no nucleus. Instead, its DNA is in a single circular chromosome floating in the cytoplasm. They also have plasmids, which are small circular rings of DNA carrying some of the bacterium's genes. About 75% of bacteria contain plasmids. Some, but not all bacteria, use long whip-like structure called flagella to swim. Some also contain chlorophyll to carry out photosynthesis. However, most bacteria feed off other living or dead organisms. Along with fungi, many bacteria are important decomposers, recycling dead organisms and waste products in the soil. Some bacteria are used by humans to make food, such as the production of yogurt by using Lactobacillus bulgaricus. Others cause disease, such as pneumococcus, which causes pneumonia. Viruses are interesting, as they are not regarded as living things. They are all parasites infecting living organisms and can only reproduce inside living organisms. The cell in which the virus lives is called the host. There are many different types of virus. Some infect the cells of animals, such as the human immunodeficiency virus, which invades human immune cells, thus making the person vulnerable to other diseases such as pneumonia and rare cancers, and this is regarded as causing AIDS. Others infect plant cells, such as the tobacco mosaic virus, which interferes with the ability of the tobacco plant to make chloroplasts, causing mottled patches to develop on the leaves. There are even viruses like the bacteriophage, shown here, which infect bacteria. Viruses are much smaller than bacterial cells, roughly 10 to 100 times smaller in diameter. Viruses are not made of cells. A virus particle is very simple. It has no nucleus or cytoplasm, and is composed of a core of genetic material surrounded by a protein coat, or capsid. The genetic material can be either DNA or RNA. In either case, the genetic material makes up just a few genes. all that is needed for the virus to reproduce inside its host cell. Sometimes a membrane called an envelope may surround a virus particle. But the virus does not make this. It is made by the host cell as it reproduces the viral particles that have infected it. So why do we say viruses are not living? Viruses do not carry out all of the normal characteristics of living things. They do reproduce, but they do this by making the host cell produce the viral particles. So if they are not living, they can be thought of as on the border between an organism and a non-living chemical. As mentioned before, viruses reproduce by infecting the host cell and taking over the host nucleus to make more virus particles. After many virus particles have been made, the host cell dies and the particles are released to infect more cells. To finish off, we need to look at pathogens. But what are pathogens? They are organisms that cause disease. The main kingdoms that contain pathogens are fungi, for example, athlete's foot. You may be prone to this if you do not wear socks in your trainers, as the fungus that causes athlete's foot likes warm, damp, dark areas to grow, like in sweaty trainers. Bacteria, such as salmonella, which causes food poisoning. Protoctists, like the one we previously mentioned, which is transmitted by mosquitoes. The plasmodium, the organism, causes malaria. And then, of course, there are the non-living viruses, such as HIV that causes AIDS, the tobacco mosaic virus infecting, funny enough, tobacco plants, influenza, and the SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID. All of these were mentioned earlier. Of course, as always, don't forget your buzzwords. There are some really important words in here which you may not have come across before, and you need to be able to spell them and feel comfortable using them in your exam answers.